compensation benefits and growth. And McBride, I'm Vice President of Programs at the James Beard Foundation. This guide here is part of our industry support work, and I'll tell you more about that in a second. But Anna, if you can advance to the next slide, we'll talk very briefly about the format for this webinar. We are recording this session. It will be published on our virtual education library at jamesbeard.org/virtual education in the next week or so. So if you miss anything, if you want to re-listen to it, share it with others, it will be available there. We'll also take questions as part of the webinar, so put them in the chat at any point. I'll moderate that and field them to Elizabeth at the end of our webinar. And then if you have technical difficulties, message using the Q&A, and Anna, who you're seeing as James Beard Foundation Zoom, will be addressing them for you. Next slide, please. Here is who will be spending the afternoon with you. As I mentioned, I'm VP of Programs, and I'll be joined by Elizabeth Tilton, founder and CEO of Oyster Sunday. Elizabeth is based in New Orleans and New York City. Her hospitality career started with several years of back of the house experience in New Orleans, and she eventually moved to New York to join Momofuku, where she was on the branding team, managed public relations and marketing, market research, and major partnerships. So she has seen many different aspects of the restaurant industry. Has also been head of brand at W&P, and then she launched Oyster Sunday in 2019, and she'll tell you more about that in a minute. I want to first tell you, and next slide, please, a little bit more about this work. Next slide. What's this guide here? So we started in 2020 doing more industry support work, obviously. And the two guides that you're seeing on the screen are two open for good guides. The first one on the left is a project we did in partnership with Deloitte around business model innovations, polling chefs, doing focus group interviews, research around business model innovations that emerged from the pandemic, with information on margins, business structure, legislation that needs to change, et cetera, around that. And then on the right, our Open for Good compensation, benefits, and growth is the guide that we are talking about today. I want to thank Ashley Koziak on the James Beard team, who spearheaded both of these projects and did a superb job with the compensation one in particular that required a lot of quarreling of a lot of people. So it came out really wonderfully, what we're all saying before. So big props to her on this. This compensation, benefits, and growth guide talks about the fact that there is not a one-size-fits-all approach to putting more money in your employees' pockets, to doing things for your staff that they need, that they want, that you need to have as part of your business. So it's a series of interviews, and Anna, you can go to the next slide. So that you can see the layout of it. This is what each page looks like. A spread, here is Amanda Cohen, for example, that gives you really visual snapshots of how they've structured things around benefits and incentives, team thinking, pivots, et cetera, challenges and achievements to make it as user-friendly as possible for you to take that information and see what you can do with it for your own businesses. So without further ado, I'm going to throw it to Elizabeth Tilton of Oyster Sunday, who will take us more deeply through the guide. She's one of the business advisors featured throughout, and she will tell you a lot more about compensation, benefits, and growth. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I know it's the end of a Wednesday, so thank you for all being here. I'm sure you've been on plenty of these calls all day. I want to kind of lay out a quick roadmap of where we're going today, but start off by introducing myself and my company. As Anne mentioned, I've been in hospitality for quite a bit, was actually medical school bound, and then decided to go into hospitality. So this topic around healthcare compensation and benefits particularly resonates and is of interest. But in general, I wanted Oyster Sunday as a company. We are a remote company, but primarily based between New Orleans and New York, which are two cities that sing to my soul. and have deep histories with both. And really what the name comes from, Oyster Sunday, it stands for operating system. And really what we seek out to do is, I've had really remarkable experiences working in startups and restaurant organizations such as Momofuku, and have seen corporate offices that are all servicing a cohort of restaurants under one chef. And in my opinion, there was no reason why we couldn't spin out a corporate office and service the over 400,000 independent operators around the United States. And really what I declare ourselves as being is kind of like a Swiss Army knife to help operators that have teams that are remarkable and have such skill sets, but maybe have some blind spots, such as if they aren't marketers, or if they need financial support or operational support or HR, we really can come in and provide those services across the board to meet their operational needs. I always say that we're a tech, data loving, tech driven company. We do rely a lot on that, but take a lot of really designed approach to everything we do touch and do. At any given time, we work with about 25 independent operators coast to coast. So we do work nationally. We did start in 2019, right before the pandemic, and very grateful for have a team of 18 of us now that are all over the United States, as mentioned, and very grateful that they've come on board, and we've been able to support operators throughout the course of the pandemic. In terms of contributing to this particular guide, I feel like, as mentioned, very passionate about the subject, but additionally, it's amazing to see. I kind of wanted to start off with the key takeaways, or like what I observed of the chefs and operators perspective that was given to the guide. Then we'll kind of we'll start with that topic, then we'll go into healthcare, talk about how does one get healthcare, what are some options that are at your fingertips, and then immediately go into 401k continues to come up. I think it's one that is top of people's mind about investing people's future. But as we talk about 401ks and kind of IRAs and things of that nature, kind of financial stability, I want to talk about fringe benefits as a broad subject. So we'll go into that. Finally, we're going to go into a Q&A, but that's kind of the roadmap. I will be cognizant of time to make sure that we have plenty of it to answer questions. But I wanted to, one thing, we'll go to the compensation model in a moment. But one thing I ended up doing after receiving it was kind of breaking down the entire guide into the locations, the employee counts, average check, wages, to help kind of for me to visualize what was provided during the guide. And I think the one thing that stood out the most is, and to what Anne had mentioned before, is like one size does not fit all. And having had back of house experience, even starting off with wages, looking at where they are now relative to when I started, or even when I'm sure many of people on this call, when you started cooking and as your whole career has continued, the one reality is that wages are going up. I think that's partially because of mandates for minimum wage. I think we'll get into tip credits in one moment. But I think that that's just really important to note as we look at this kind of swath of examples across the United States in all different employee counts, knowing that when we look at employees and size of companies, and we always have to consider above and below 50 people, or full-time equivalents, as they say, because a lot of our conversation today will be contingent on that very important number, because and let me clarify real quick what full-time equivalents mean. It's 50 people who work over 30 hours a week, or compounded even part-time that exceed over 50 equivalents of full-time employment over 30 hours a week. A lot of federal mandates come in post that as small businesses. So I know restaurants, as you can see in this whole count here, it's unbelievable how many cusp right below it. So a lot of decision makings you have are going to be, it puts you in a great position. It puts you in a position that allows you to make decisions that are not contingent on federal mandates. But in the same time, federal mandates kind of are that tipping point where we have a lot more leveraging power when it comes to some benefits, and like such as healthcare and small business plans, which I will go pretty deep into in a moment. But I just think that that's just a very important number we need to kind of put a pin into for the sake of our conversation today. And tip credits. The United States, every state's different. We are, makes us unique and complicated. So as we work with our kind of operators coast to coast, is something we have to be very really abreast on, is who has tip credits, who doesn't, why does it matter? What are the implications on a P&L for operators? And I think that the one thing you can always take away are that the coast tend to have high minimum wages, likely not tip credits. The South tends to do federal mandated $2.13 an hour. with like that's being the employee's employer's responsibility. And I think as we kind of talk about all these examples, and we have to weigh those two extremes and know that most states meet in the middle, because everything comes back to your financial stability. And I think that was just something I just want to really put a huge asterisk by that, because every model is different, but the kind of the baseline decision makings we have to make are all contingent on really the compensation at its core, then paired with what cash is left over to then invest into your team. And then you'll see here, I just thought this was interesting, the service charge versus the pooled. It's amazing to see how much that's changing right now, that service charge. And I think the last two columns here are really indicative of I think during COVID, a lot of diners were really exposed to different types of service models that became available. And I think that we had this huge catalyst, not only I think the press did a really great job of putting and exposing things such as third-party delivery services and the costs associated all the way down to service and like what restaurants really it takes to run them. And I think that as a result of that, people who are early adopters as diners are much more, I guess, open-minded or educated. You can kind of insert a bunch of words in that sentence as understanding what does it mean to do tip pooling? What does it mean to have service charge? So I think as operators and people on this call, we're at a moment now where I think we can get a little bit more creative, understanding that in most major cities that have dining experiences, there is a vast knowledge base now that maybe did not exist 10 years ago that puts these options on the table and doesn't rely on just one operator to educate their or to inform their diners. So I think that's important to start with as we continue in the conversation. And I wanted to then go straight into the guide. So let me pull that up for everyone. All right. So on top of the compensation that I've kind of outlined and I'm happy also just to note, I'll send my email out in a second to kind of, if you want it, happy to share it, that kind of breakdown of spreadsheet. But I wanted to kind of go, as we talk about compensation takeaways, also talk about benefit takeaways that will set the precedent of what we continue to discuss here. And I think that the one thing that was very apparent in all of the examples provided by all these amazing chefs and operators around the United States. And you can kind of tell in this benefits and incentives, the four things that were common across the board are healthcare, PTO, personal time off, paid time off, flex schedule, and family leave came up. Family leave with the FMLA kind of hits that 50-person threshold. So there's some requirements around that for large groups. And then there were a really great list of all these operators who have what I will declare as like a tier 2 or nice to have, knowing that at this point, those key benefits of the four I've just listed are pretty much, I think, when we're talking about recruitment and retention of our team members, I think at this point, those are really, they're no longer nice to haves. I think they're really kind of seen as mandates on behalf of our employees. And as we talk about now, we kind of go into this tier 2 that if the budget allows for it, or the operator has these kind of built in, there's things like therapy, continuing education, cross-training, dining stipends, 401ks, which I'll get to in a moment, referral bonuses. There's a lot of other things that employees can see as incentives for their employment. But I think at the end of the day, what I kind of distill down is like when as an employer who has a team and employees, first off, I always feel amazed that they come to work every day, because I feel like that's an opt-in choice that is not a given. And so I think that as we build teams and we keep and retain people, I think we really need to recognize like what a powerful thing that is. But as employers to employees, I think there's three things that we can offer, and it's time, it's respect, and it's compensation. And I think that we have to weigh, I think people I remember when I was first coming into the workforce, I was always told I was allowed to have two of them. And I think the next generation that's coming in is requiring all three. And I think that we need to weigh, and they can be in different proportions based off people's needs and what makes sense in their lives. But I don't think the joke of saying you can only give two of three, or you can only require two of three, no longer stands. So as we weigh out what benefits are and fringe benefits, as we get into that topic in a moment, I think we just need to put that out on the table. I talk quickly, so hope you're all doing all right out there. The next thing I wanted to talk about, let's start with health insurance. And, for me, I won't go through all the tidbits we have here that both Michael and I have submitted. I think you're happy to read that when you have a moment, but I wanted to kind of fill in some gaps because I think that's more important for this conversation. And I kind of wanted to start off with, what changed and what options do we have as small business owners? Again, knowing that threshold of 50 team members kind of plays a strong role in this conversation. And I think that the most important part is that when the Affordable Care Act, or ACA, as we'll talk about it here, rolled out, really what it became known is that kind of 50 full-time equivalent came to play. And at that point, after 50 full-time equivalents as an employer, you are required to provide health insurance or else you get fined by the, and I think one thing is, it may take a year or two to find out that you're not potentially providing healthcare, but I do think it's one of those things, like as an employer, we need to it's better to get ahead of it because the amount of just fines you may receive will far exceed what could be the potential of what your principal amount will be for your healthcare. And I think I think most people in this conversation here we're talking about this because we care, but I just wanted to note that being proactive and getting ahead of it is really valuable. But I think the one thing that's required is that not only do you have to require health insurance, and there's a bunch of plans out there, there's everything from just providing what people call MEC, which stands for minimum essential coverage. That tends to mean high deductible catastrophic care. But the reality is when the ACA rolled out, what it became is that you have to offer insurance that meets what they call the minimum viable plan. And what that means is that for any employee you have, that it cannot exceed 9.8% of their income. So when it comes to as a small business owner, particularly in hospitality, there's two things we run against. One is, in order to provide that, we have to have care. We have to provide care to our employees that have to be a pretty low principal amount, depending on the coverage they're receiving. But we also need high participation. So in order to get high participation, that means we need to cover, some employees can't cover their kind of principal amount, meaning it goes to the employer, because if we don't have high participation, we don't get coverage by health insurance companies. So a lot of people that we've talked to over the course of the last 2.5 years really come against that wall. And I think that I just want to bring that up there because there are alternatives. There's other things that allow us to come together as a group, or that maybe a broker is able to find other plans for you that are maybe higher deductible, and there's tiered where you have a high deductible plan, then you have one that's a little bit higher coverage, but your minimum plan covers most people. And then someone who has maybe a manager or someone who has a family wants to go into a higher plan, they have choice. So I think that there are really creative brokers out there. We work with one up in the Northeast that I highly really respect and has done remarkable work. But I think that there's a lot of brokers out there that can get creative about how to find coverage on behalf of your team. As I mentioned, when it comes to finding care, I think there's the three things I kind of think about are healthcare brokers. One thing to note as an employer, there's a lot of times you don't, until you get coverage, you don't pay for coverage, or you don't pay for brokers to really go out and find plans for you, which I think is a really important thing to recognize, because I would highly recommend finding multiple plans to then weigh against each other. Not necessarily multiple brokers, but multiple plans. And then there's also PEOs, which you may have heard of, like ADP is a PEO, and it means a professional employer organization. And they basically aggregate a bunch of companies together to come with buying power to go to a healthcare broker. They tend to be more expensive on administration, but they are an option for small businesses. And then finally, this very long acronym, which I will read out loud because I have to remind myself what it stands for, which is a Qualified Small Employer Health Reimbursement Arrangement. This also rolled out during the Affordable Care Act. And basically what it means, and we can talk about this offline to anyone who's interested, but it allows the employer that if you are under 50 people, you want to help offset healthcare, but you may not have your own small business plan. You're able to then say, you can encourage people to go on the ACA and then contribute every month to their paycheck at a tax deduction to offset their cost to the ACA. So it's a really great alternative and kind of a creative solution for those who may want to contribute, but may not have a small business plan. But that is my main thing when it comes to healthcare. I think across, as we go into the benefits and fringe benefits conversation, I think the most important part, and as I mentioned twice in this document here, is, you really want to survey your team first to figure out what participation looks like, because it's really going to be indicative of if you get coverage. And the second part is you got to run the numbers. I think we always go back to P&Ls and to forecasting to really figure out what is viable for healthcare and for benefits. And I think run them once and twice and get a different opinion and keep going at it. And the more you identify where that margin can come from, then you can really find a plan that makes sense for your company. That really, I always say that your company has to be a company in order to not only employ, but to provide healthcare. And so you can't take too much of that margin away to not make the finances viable. I will leave it at that for healthcare and move on to fringe benefits, because I think this is something that we're getting a lot of inquiry about. And I want to distinguish the difference between benefits and fringe benefits. And the biggest distinguisher is tax deduction, in my opinion, is what is able to be seen, what is seen as income versus what is seen as tax deductible income. And when it comes to fringe benefits, and this comes down to offsetting continuing education or some other ones, there's a certain cohort that are not tax deductible. So that's kind of where I delineate the two. And when it comes to 401ks, I think this is a really interesting, and let me clarify, 401ks, I do not say as a fringe. I think it's a financial, it allows people to invest in people's financial future. I do think that's an opportunity for employers to really have a moment to think about when healthcare is established, think about that next kind of future planning. And I think to Anne's point at the beginning of the conversation about how do we turn this into a career? And I think these kind of benefits sit there and say, I'm investing in you now, and I'm going to invest in you in the future. And I want you to take this with you, and I'm going to meet you where you are as a contribution part of that. When it comes down to it, I think going through for 401ks, I think in general, going through a broker similar to healthcare is a really smart place to start. There's some interesting companies have come online, such as Betterment, which is one that is much more of a tech-driven example of not going through traditional 401k search. But some companies that come to mind are like John Hancock. ADP also has their own 401k. Gusto, as another PO, offers that. And then all major banks, depending on your bank arrangement you have, also have 401k brokers and kind of advisors, if you will, to help you think through what makes sense for your company. But I think that's also a really great, a great spot to start. And I think there's never, similar to how, I know we aren't going to talk about rent in this conversation today, but similar to how you bear a relationship with your landlord, I think bearing a relationship with your bank is just as important as a business owner. So the more you can kind of reinvest into that relationship, such as with 401k planning, I would highly recommend it. I think the other thing I really wanted to talk about when it comes to 401 decision-making, besides thinking through, I guess, finding an advisor to help out with that, I think you really need, there's on the financial side, two main things you need to consider. One that I think bear a lot of weight. One is the amount of fees associated with the management of 401k. So it's not necessarily only about, providing the 401k, matching your employees, the degree in which they invest, but it's also about, there's a huge amount of administration fees that can happen. So I think making sure you allocate a couple $1,000s a year just for the maintenance of a 401k is very valuable. And then that's number one. So just kind of the administration costs. And the second one is really making sure that the plan you do get has a fair amount of investment choices. And what I mean by that is tiers of investment. I think that, usually a traditional 401k will have very aggressive investment and much more modest or conservative investments. And as you're thinking through, because I think it depends on where people are in their lives, of how I say, I don't want to necessarily use the word aggressive, but how risk averse they are in investment. I think that that's something that's really important. So that's kind of number one, is those two extremes of very conservative versus very aggressive investment. The second one is really thinking about how much stock and bond ratio you have, because that will also bear weight in how much it fluctuates and how much growth there is. So just make sure that as you're talking to your 401k investor, that those are things, or advisor, excuse me, those are things that are on the table that you do ask questions about. And then I think the last thing is I'm all about data, and asking for historical proof never hurts. Like, they should be able to sit there and tell you what forecasting has happened, how those portfolios have performed in the past, so you fully understand. And I would ask for 5, 10, at least 5 years, particularly given COVID, making sure they give you a good understanding of the arc of these investments. So those are things I would just make sure you put on the table. One other really interesting part when it comes to 401ks, and something I've recently learned about, so I want to speak on it kind of broadly without much detail, because I don't want to misspeak, and we're doing some investigation on our end. But there's a really interesting thing where, on top of, I have a list here, and this, as we contributed beyond the 401k, there's also simple IRAs and SEP IRAs, which actually came up as one of the benefits one of the restaurants did contribute to currently in this guide. But one thing to consider is that when it comes to 401ks, there's actually something called a qualified education benefit that has recently rolled out. The time period, I don't know, like the timeline, I'm not quite sure, but I'll get clarification on. But basically what it allows people to do is say you offered a 401k, you matched your employees to a certain degree based on investment schedules. You basically can offer your employees who opt into 401ks, they can contribute to their 401k with tax implications. And you as an employer can choose whether or not to match their 401k or to pay down their student loans. That is a new thing that I've recently heard about, which I think is really important for this conversation, because when it comes to 401ks, I think particularly for employees and team members that may be recently out of college or culinary school or graduate school, I think that they're probably, when you're talking about investing in your future, I think we need to alleviate pressure from the past. And the option of an employer to be able to contribute to paying down their debt, I think, is a very different incentive for employees to choose to opt into these plans. Because I think it makes it much more tangible of something that allows them to kind of move forward and to like think about really that career development, to not bury this weight and thinking about paying part of their paycheck into something that's their future planning, while knowing they have this kind of this responsibility with them that they bear now. So I wanted to mention that. I think it's a really remarkable decision and something we should put on the table. And anyone who's interested, again, we're doing research now to figure out how much, what's the degree, how does it work? But we will publish that and make that public as soon as we find out. All right. So that gets me through quickly 3 of the 4 topics. The last thing I wanted to talk about before opening up to Q&A and giving time for that is, over the course, here, let me actually show this first. So at Oyster Sunday, we have been working, it's something, as mentioned, very passionate about, is kind of benefits in general. As over the course of the last 2 years, we have been working on what we have now called the Oyster Sunday Benefits Program. And really, to give you a little backdrop of what this is we did a whole kind of analysis of what are benefits in the industry, how do they exist, and what degree. And we looked at hotel groups and Google and a bunch of different kind of comps, and sat there and said, okay, so if we can we know that benefits, and I'll call this, for the sake of this conversation, like lifestyle benefits, because benefits of healthcare is like a necessity, as is like, and lifestyle benefits are ones that really help round out the holistic person. So I think I'm focusing much more on the latter for this part of the conversation. And what we looked at was, sat there and said, okay, what are the pain points of employment in the culinary industry? How do we now build something that addresses that on behalf of the employer? And so we built this benefits program, and I'll show you all access to the back end as well. But it's basically a dashboard that connects employees to preventative care, mental health, physical wellness, family planning, continuing education, and then culinary tools and apparel. and we have about 20 vendors on it. And we've pre-negotiated a 15 to 50% off of their services. So on top of, and now it's accessible to any operator in the United States. And it kind of comes out to about $3 an employee per team. So a team of 15 would be $45 a month. And on the back end, an employee, no matter front of house, back of house, part-time, full-time, has access to choose what makes sense for their lives and opt into anything they need. So that is kind of what this program is. And, it's a full built out dashboard, which I'll show you quickly now. So what happens is that the employee is given a login once we have their email address. Oops, misspelled that. And it goes to this dashboard, where here they have, again, this is kind of, we start off with the table of contents, but we have preventative care, which is everything from vitamins and telemedicine, which has such companies as Sesame, Spora Health, which focuses much more on health for the BIPOC community, Clear, which is dental, Spot Insurance is coming online, that is catastrophic care, mental and physical wellness, from everything from, this is actually kind of like the Uber of massages called Soothe, crisis text line, which is much more, really mental health and kind of helping people with, that are in need immediately. Family planning, which is everything from fertility, mindful return, which really focuses on paternity, maternity leave, and coming back into the workforce. Financial gym, which you talk about financial literacy and understanding your own, how do you invest in your own future. Urban Center for childcare, WAG for dog walking, so on and so forth. And then the culinary tools and apparel, which I feel like the holidays was a very important category. So everything from aprons from Tilton, Japanese knives from Couturier, kitchen tools from Gear. So it really runs the gamut of saying, like, what are all things that our teams need? But the crux of it really started with preventative care. And so here I'll just use Sesame as an example of what an employee sees. But here we give a little description of the company. We say what they offer as part of this arrangement. So we have an additional 15% off, giving 75% off care. And telemedicine specifically allows, particularly for under and uninsured, to have access to primary care physicians that they may need to have their physical or their annual check-in. A little video, because visuals never hurt. And then an example of services. So this is everything from mental health and in-person or video chat. It really runs the gamut. Women's health, skincare, diabetic care, anything that people really need, they can choose and have access to at a very affordable price. And they can know exactly what the cost is up front. And then again, we have other arrangements, but this is something we have built and we have made available nationally to any operator in the United States. And for the James Beard Foundation, for anyone here, we are going to be offering 10% off everything, just because we want more people to have access to it. And the only reason when we have any costs associated in any capacity is because we're reinvesting all that cash back in to continue to drop these costs down on behalf of the employees. But that is the benefits program. And again, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer any questions along the way during our Q&A.
So Elizabeth, the employer pays for that and the employee pays per employee, or how does that work?
Yeah, so the employer pays for their teams. So it comes out to, like, for a team of 15, it's around $45 a month. For a team of 25, it's $75 a month. It's about $3 an employee all in. But when they get in, they have access to anything that makes sense in their lives. Yeah. But I think those are the main topics I wanted to discuss on this call. And I really wanted to spend a fair bit of time really opening it up to Q&A, which I know we have a solid 25 minutes going back into that. But thank you all for listening. I do, again, as mentioned, tend to talk quickly. The brain's running, but I hope it was topics that were of interest today.
So we do have a couple of questions in the chat, and continue putting them there as Elizabeth said, there's lots of time for questions. So the first was a very practical one. Evan was asking if you can share the name of the Northeast broker you recommend.
Absolutely. His name is Scott Jenkins, and I can happy to introduce you. My email is elizabeth@oystersunday.com. And so please feel free to email me. We'll introduce you directly.
And so this is a question I have and related. How do you tell a good broker from a not so good broker? What should you look for when you're looking for a broker for something like this?
Great question. I think the reason why well, first off, with the reason why we've kind of had an allegiance to Scott is that he worked at United Healthcare and in the culinary department, focused on finding hospitality companies, healthcare. So in terms of he understands the kind of pain points associated with hospitality, which I think is really, really important. And I think the other side of it is, I think also the creativity of a broker, understanding that, they aren't just going out and finding like a very high deductible plan, but they're thinking about, okay, if it is a high deductible plan, what else can we do to offset that cost? What does your P&L look like? How much participation do you think you have? I think it really comes down to their question asking. Unfortunately, sometimes it takes a little trial and error to find the right one. And it depends too on where your company is based. I think that the reason why Scott has, we've gone with him is that he has national understanding and coverage, versus some brokers only focus on certain carriers in certain states because that is their allegiance or because that is just the market that they know. So I think it depends on what your company needs at the end of the day. It's a great question.
Chris is asking, given the age and educational profile of the typical employee in our industry, do you think the employer match is the most important feature of a 401k?
Employer match. I think in order to incentivize your team to join in, to match it is really important. I think that you could offer a 401k and have them, do it on their own and opt in part of their income towards a 401k. But I think matching is an incentive that's a pretty powerful thing to offer to incentivize people to opt into it. And I think to remember that you're already paying an administration fee, and the base fee is already pretty high. And per an employee it's that's kind of not, I shouldn't say nominal given, but it's not the chunk of the administration fee. So the more participation, the more benefit it is on the employer as well to kind of offset the cost per employee. But I think it's really important. I think as I brought up that the student loan contribution, I think that's a whole nother ball game where, I think that to me, when I heard about that, is a very powerful thing to offer your team.
Here we go. Jen was asking if you can expand on the qualified small employer health reimbursement arrangement. How is the reimbursement money classified accounting wise?
It should be classified like healthcare would be classified. So the tax implications are, it would be seen as such. So in terms of, it's almost seen as although it's cash given to an employee in a paycheck, it's categorized as a benefit and it has the implications of tax on that. So that's the beauty of it, is that it's seen as a healthcare contribution versus just cash. So that's why it's very important to go through their protocol and their steps. And usually it's easier to do it through it can be done if someone's on someone else's healthcare plan and you want to contribute. So for say someone has a spouse and you want to offset some of their healthcare, or they are going through the Affordable Care Act and you're contributing them a monthly stipend towards their healthcare. Does that answer the question?
Jen, if that does not answer the question, feel free to refine in the chat. Nancy says she loves the term lifestyle benefits that acknowledges people as individuals, indeed, and also adds that she did not see much on financial literacy, buying a house, renting versus buying a car, creating a family budget, etc. Is that something that you're also working on?
Yeah, we have financial gym that's included in our benefits program. I would highly recommend, regardless if it's through our benefits program or not, I would highly recommend looking it up. They talk about financial literacy in the broadest strokes. So it is about planning for your future. How do you plan for college education and house planning and mortgages? So I think it addresses that question directly. I think they're the best resource I have seen on the topic. So it's a really, I think, a very powerful company. So I highly recommend looking it up. And we can put it up in the chat too, so you can know how it's spelled.
Great. Yeah, and that is, I mean, for that transition from job to career, that is so essential, right? To have all of this and thinking about, yeah, how to budget, how to think long term beyond the job you immediately have.
Yeah.
So Jen is asking a follow-up question on how do you pronounce the abbreviation? Coursera, or is there just spelling out? Okay, I'll just say it like that. You'll understand what I mean. Coursera can be given as a bonus.
It is seen as like, it's the same way if you had your paycheck and you were contributing to your benefits, as a line item is seen as like healthcare. So it's applied the same. So it's not seen as like a bonus. Like a bonus would be taxable and aggressively taxable in most states. So it's not seen as that. It's seen as like a benefit. In the same way in which sometimes you can do transportation benefits in New York City, like it's seen as the same kind of line item that has the tax implications. So it's not seen as income. It would not be taxed as taxable income.
Okay, great. All right, keep the questions coming, but I have one that comes up over and over again when we talk about this topic. In one of the Judini, who's featured in the guide, has health benefits where she covers 100%. Her business covers 100%, right? There's no copay for employees. That means that as an employer and as an owner, she's taking a pay cut herself, right? What is when people come to you and say, I want to do this, I don't know how to make it work from a financial structure perspective. What is step one in two variations? Step one, when this is about reconfiguring your existing financial structure to make it work. And then step one, when you're opening a new business, you're reopening a restaurant, whatever, and you have the chance to do it starting from zero.
Yeah, man. So I think that this is such a great question. I think when it comes down to it, and I always say, go back to your financial modeling, right? You have to go back to like, what is viable? Like what is per person per year going to cost? The same way in which you'd be like thinking about labor period, and then just adding that in. But I think there's so many creative strategies. And I think going back to that spreadsheet we looked at in the beginning of the call, looking at everyone has different kind of breakdowns of how they're doing it. But I think most important part, if you look at that service charge, one thing that I've been seeing a fair bit of is in New York City, I've seen like COVID recovery surcharge. And I've also currently have seen wellness. And I think that the difference between, and we have to kind of delineate the difference between service charge and like kind of a wellness charge, if for lack of a better word for now, is that the wellness or the COVID surcharge is like a 2 to 5%. Compensation, or excuse me, like totally thinking about a service charge is like 20%. It's the expectation of a tip. And in New York City, there's people who built it into the cost of the SKU, and then because it's illegal to add it into the end of your bill because the 80-20 rule. But in most states, you can add it in the end and say we applied 20% service charge or 18%. But I think what's really fascinating, and to answer your question, Anne, is that go back to your P&L, run the numbers, figuring out what it's really going to cost you, then saying, okay, I have 1,000 benefits I want to apply to my team. I know that the following are monumental and key. I know the other tier 2, tier 3 are ones I can do in 3, 5, 10 years from now, and then rolling them out, knowing where your cash flow is. But I think do not underestimate the ability on your check or in the cost of your items that you, as an employer, if you have these kind of a wellness charge, then you're able to apply that to wellness benefits. It's not seen as a tip, because a tip would have to go straight to the employee, and the employer cannot touch, as I'm sure everyone knows in this call. But a service charge or some other delineation, you have as an employer have the right to determine where that is applied. And I think that's a very, very important distinguisher. And that can be done by baking it into the cost of your menu items or by doing a service charge. But I think at the end of the day is like, and I sound like a broken record, but going back to your P&L, running the numbers, making sure it's viable is like so important. Because if you sit there and say, I want to provide 100% healthcare, but you have only 6 months runway given cash, that's really not going to get anyone too far.
We had last week we held our Women's Entrepreneurial Leadership Alumni Summit, and the first session was on mental health with Hazel Aviles from Not 9 to 5. And I don't remember exactly what the numbers were, but she broke down the cost of investing in your employees' mental health as the cost per year and the cost per employee. So this seems like there's also, looking at what you can afford, but this is also an investment in your business, and it might be cheaper in the long run to spend a little bit more on your employees without having to replace them because they burn out or move on, right?
There's an estimate where it's like, I can't remember the exact number, so bear with me, but it was something around like $5,300 and something was the cost associated with onboarding an employee. So if you think about the overarching, like, could you use that and like every month do an increment amount where you're investing into their future? Because at the end of the day, like the knowledge set, the understanding of your company, the kind of the fiber that does without disruption there's such a value to that beyond just wanting to care for someone, having a team. I just think that if you're talking about just kind of removing the emotional element and talking about the practical as an employer, like you can't underestimate that.
Omar has a couple of comments. So he says, we have government subsidized healthcare with dental and vision. The plans run $275 a month per employee. I have a similar question, as we used to do direct healthcare that we paid. So I roll that over and we pay $100 a month towards people's healthcare. And I guess the question was around what I was asking in terms of the financial structure around that.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that number. Usually we always estimate that most cover, and again, this is not a public plan, but most private plans run, just so people know, it's like between $425 and like $455 per employee per month, solo coverage. So I just think when you're thinking about what you do contribute. But I guess I'm intrigued. Omar, what state are you in? Out of curiosity.
Michigan. And he also says, with all the added benefits of PTO, quarterly bonus, paid maternity leave, etc., when is the benefits enough? We want to offer all the things that we wish we had growing up in the industry.
Right. Well, I always say, I think that when it comes down to it's time, respect, and compensation. And I think every employee will weigh those differently, but I think at the end of the day is you want to have a generous plan, but you also need to, we need to have businesses that are functioning. I think there can be creative ways, for example, PTO, we think about, does the whole restaurant close for a week? Like that's giving time back without having inventory, and some cutting, and some labor additions to that, or potentially overtime and moments where it may be slow and you're cutting people or you're doing whatever needs to happen. So I think there's creative ways of, can you provide really meaningful moments for your team? Or maybe PTO, or I shouldn't say PTO, but maybe some time and continuing education is done together during those time slots. So I think, I don't know what's enough. I think people are asking of a lot right now. And I think that's across multiple industries. And I think at the end of the day is you need to offer for what makes sense for your company and what at the end of the day in 5 years from now looks like success for you and your restaurant, and deciding like, this is how far this is the kind of culture I want to build. This is what I'm capable of doing, and clearly communicating those expectations, because we can't all offer, unlimited PTO and 100% healthcare coverage as much as everyone may want to. It just sometimes doesn't work, or it's not viable. And so I think it's just being clear and upfront and setting the expectation with your employee of what is most important. And there can be a lot of different ways that, employees can find value in their employment. Maybe it is the flexible work schedule, but not the PTO. Or maybe it's, maybe it is the PTO and with service included, and they know exactly what their monthly compensation is going to be. Both of those extremes there's people on both sides. Mm-hmm. It's a matter of what you want to put out. And then you will find, in my opinion, that those employees will come to you.
Yeah, and of course, there are things you can adapt as your employees might change. And then there are things like healthcare benefits or 401k that might be harder. You cannot change that every single month, right? Or probably every 6 months. So
yeah.
What Omar was saying and what you were asking about where he was located, and he said it's offered through Wayne County, that makes me think how much needs to happen at the legislative level to also support restaurants, support restaurants as they support their staff better. What can be done? What needs to be done?
I mean, so interesting, because I do think like such as Wayne County and also DC has DC Health Net. There's a lot of these micro moments happening. But, I think one thing that's very interesting, because of the pandemic, we've had organizations such like the IRC and ROAR, and then obviously James Beard have put out materials and advocacy on behalf of the industry. I always joke that we're like a group of pirates out in the ocean, and we're fine. We find each other and we salute and keep moving. But I think for the first time, we're kind of in a meaningful way coalescing in a different way. And I think, and I'm not putting this burden or responsibility on those organizations, but I do think there's a key opportunity for organizations like the IRC, who are very going at politics, and they're doing a great job with the Restaurant Relief Fund and sitting there and running at that right now on behalf of all of us, which their work I admire. I do think there's a moment once that maybe we turn a corner or the priorities shift, there could be a moment where what does it look like for us all to come together underneath one organization and advocate on behalf for health insurance plans, like the way in which some other unions or some like the different guilds and things like that do on behalf of their freelancers. I mean, I think there's something to be gleaned from that we as an industry could really take away. I don't know the answer to that. I wish I did, but I do think there's a lot of brilliant minds who are running at these topics that I think can hopefully across state lines and across city boundaries figure out what could a healthcare program look like for operators under 50 people, because at that point that's kind of a moment where we're all looking for the same thing and none of us have the same information.
And on one hand, it's so fragmented and happens in cities and states completely different one from the next. And then on the other, is it easier to do it at a smaller scale like that? And if you're a restaurant owner, to talk to a city council or to talk to your state representative versus going straight to federal? Do you have any opinion there?
Yeah. Or? I think it depends on the city. I mean, I think about, I'm based here in New Orleans, which is a remarkable city, but Louisiana, we abide by, there's no tax, there's no tip credit. We abide by federal minimum wage, which is $2.13 an hour, and I don't know how on a local level I could go and say, please provide healthcare, when it's very apparent that there's some legacy institutions that are not really helping us help people get minimum wage to invest in their healthcare. And I think that's something where it's going to be state by state. And I do think at some point it has to be federal, or it has to be, we have to glean from cities and states that are potentially, further along in the process than some, to then figure out how to go back to our state level or our city level. I think that once we share that information across state or across state lines, or, I think we'll be further along. Yeah.
You have a couple more minutes if you want to ask a question to Elizabeth. I'll ask you one more while people are typing. So obviously staffing continues to be a crisis, right? And then there's all these things about bonuses. What are employees really looking for, as in order to even come or stay in the industry? You talk to a lot of people, obviously, who are looking for benefits. You talk to employers, you talk to employees. What are the three things you find are most effective in terms of attracting or retaining employees?
Compensation, like baseline, and I think consistent compensation. So the predictability, where if it rains and the patio's shut, you're not getting cut. I think that's something that can't be underestimated. I think healthcare. I think because since COVID, anyone on the front lines, may it be healthcare providers or teachers or hospitality workers, had to choose between compensation and healthcare and their own care, right? They had to weigh which one weighed more to show up to work every day, because sometimes because without employment, you're not covered. unless you're on the ACA or you have other coverage from other means. And I think that leaves people in a big pickle for many a reason and very vulnerable. And so I think health can't be underestimated. And I think lastly, I think there's a lot of people who are very passionate about this industry and want to see a career out of it. And I think that a lot of our vulnerabilities were laid out to bear over the last 2 years and really kind of said, really highlighted across the board, and as it should have been. And I think that there's going to be this next generation that's going to want balance in their lives, but also really care about this industry. And maybe it's because of their food studies program or because of sustainability or their passion for wine or whatever it may be, but there's this constant fiber that they care. And I think that, as we talk about healthcare and hospitality broadly, I think that there's the willingness to care for people, may it be when they're sick or when they're healthy, as we do in hospitality theoretically. It's like that comes from the same real desire to take care of people. And I think that anyone who comes to this industry, that resonates with them in some capacity. And maybe also there's a lot of people in the industry who do it because it meets their lifestyle and they have other responsibilities. So I don't want to make it too romantic, but I do think that we need to consider that as part of on the table of as people choose to get into this industry, we need to tell them why they should stay.
Yeah. Well, that's a great way to end. And I'll ask Anna to just pull back the last slide of our PowerPoint so that we have contact information on the screen also and where to download the guide and find Elizabeth. Anna Magnusson, our programs coordinator, is actually a food studies student. So finishing her master's degree in a couple of weeks. I want to thank her, and I also want to thank our media team at JBF, who's done a tremendous amount of work for this webinar, but mostly for the guide itself. So all the invisible people who really deserve a shout out. So thank you for everyone. Elizabeth, thank you so very much. This was really informative. I think this is only the beginning of our conversations around this. And I hope that we'll be able to impose on you going forward for more resources for our audience.
Please do. We're open books over here at Oyster Sunday, so don't hesitate to reach out.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you who joined us tonight. This was really wonderful to spend this hour together and to make huge progresses for the industry. All of these changes will make sure that this is a career, not just a job for the next generation of the industry. So thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you so much.